Chapter 6. The town of St. Farr doesn't receive many visitors. It isn't located on a major highway. It isn't a truck stop town. It isn't midway between two cities. So when the new person arrives in town, they were easily spotted as an outsider. Early in the morning, the day after the music in St. Farr died, the Oldtimers gathered together outside the blue and white house in Old Town and headed to Harvey's, just like they had every morning. The Oldtimers were a group of 6 old, nondescript, retired men who had been in St. Farr as long as anyone could remember. All of them lived in Old Town. None of them were married or had children. All of them were rudely killing time until the hand of death would come and free them from their misery. Every morning, the Oldtimers would meet in front of a beautiful white Victorian house with blue trim. Then they would walk together to Harvey's Cafe for breakfast. Once there, the men would monopolize the small counter space, filling every stool at the bar. There, the Oldtimers would read their newspapers, tell tired stories of their time in St. Farr, and make snide remarks to nearly every one of Harvey's customers. Harvey was too polite to tell them to leave. In addition to not wanting to be rude to his elders, the men were paying customers who consistently stayed all day, buying breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the small cafe. Those are the kind of customers you need to put up with when you own a small restaurant in a town this size. The Oldtimers were too much for Harvey's other customers to handle. Other than the Oldtimers' egg sandwiches, tuna fish melts, and other old man meals, all orders from Harvey's were placed to go. That ensured the customer would only have minimal contact with the Oldtimers. Unfortunately, Harvey didn't have the luxury of only quickly entering the cafe, grabbing food, and leaving without conversation. The Oldtimers made it to the familiar town square, just as Harvey had unlocked the front door of his cafe for the day. They walked toward their daily destination, but stopped as they passed the now closed KOBO radio station. There was a man standing in front of the station, politely knocking on the glass door. The man was dressed in all black. A black cowboy hat sat atop his head. On his shoulders, black wool jacket with the lapel turned upward. Black slacks covered his bottom, featuring a crisp pleat down the front of each leg. Shiny black, freshly polished dress shoes completed the ensemble. The Oldtimer stopped a few feet away from the man. "Station's closed," the Oldtimer said flatly. The man turned toward the group to reveal a gaunt, waxy face. He spoke. "How long till it opens?" The man's voice was quiet and monotone. "Never again," the Oldtimers replied. "No one listened, so they shut it down." The man in black looked puzzled. He thanked the Oldtimers and went back to knocking on the door. The Oldtimers were already late for their breakfast at Harvey's. As much as they wanted to stay and berate the visitor until he understood, there were 6 egg and cheese sandwiches waiting for them on the counter of the cafe. They set off, murmuring to one another about how new people in St. Farr always made the place worse. Harvey, seeing his most loyal customers enter the shop a few minutes later than usual, greeted the Oldtimers with a hearty, "Good morning!" The Oldtimers, annoyed that there was someone new in town, grumbled and half-hearted, "Morning," back at Harvey. 6 uniform breakfast sandwiches sat on the counter, one in front of each stool. The Oldtimers walked across the small dining area and sat down in their same spots to begin their daily ritual of devouring an over-easy egg and melted American cheese on an everything bagel. As they tucked into their sandwiches in silence, the electronic chime notifying Harvey that the front door had opened played across the cafe. No one came into the cafe this early in the day. In fact, Harvey only opened the cafe this early to accommodate the Oldtimers and their need for a morning pick-me-up bagel. The Oldtimers turned their heads toward the dining area to see who was disturbing their morning tradition. It was the visitor who they had encountered outside of the radio station. The visitor shuffled his sleek, shiny shoes across the wooden-stained floor of the cafe and gave a weak wave with one pale arm. The Oldtimers returned their sandwiches to their plates and prepared to launch an opening verbal salvo toward the cafe intruder. "Hey, buddy, you finally figured out what closed meant." The visitor showed up. The visitor looked up at the Oldtimers. His lips were so thin you could barely make them out on his corpse-like face. Still, his look of confusion was apparent. "I know what closed means," he said genuinely. "I was just hoping they would be inside." "Who would be inside? You looking for someone?" "I don't know. radio people? Boy, that station is run by Patty. She's the only one who ever sets foot in that building. Patty? Patty can turn on the radio? Patty ain't gonna turn on the radio. She turned it off and quit last night. You should have been there. Took everything she had not to break down crying in front of God, Ferris, and all of St. Farr. The visitor's confusion turned to concern. Patty is gone? Now how would we know that? The old-timers asked. We ain't her babysitter. She was in the park last night, and that's the last we saw of her. Harvey cut in. Sir, I'm sure Patty is still here, but it's still pretty early in the morning. I can call her later if you'd like. Yes, the visitor replied. That would be helpful. The visitor turned to leave, but the old-timers weren't quite done with the conversation. Wait, you ain't gonna buy nothing? The visitor stopped and looked at the old-timers once again. You gotta get yourself an egg sandwich or something. You came in here and interrupted Harvey's morning. It's the least you could do. The visitor looked at Harvey. 1 egg sandwich, please? Harvey nodded and turned to the griddle, where he quickly cracked an egg and started prepping the bagel and cheese. The old-timers wouldn't take their eyes off the visitor, looking him up and down again and again. The visitor stood deathly still, staring forward, but at nothing in particular, waiting for Harvey to finish his order. Finally, after one of the longest minutes ever experienced in St. Farr, Harvey assembled the sandwich and wrapped it in paper. Here you go, sir. That'll be $3, Harvey said, holding the wrapped sandwich out over the counter. The visitor shuffled up to the counter between two of the old-timers and took the hot sandwich from Harvey. He handed back a single $100 bill. Harvey looked at the bill and quickly said, I don't know if I have the cash to break the 100. Keep it, the visitor replied flatly as he walked past the tables in the dining area toward the front door. The visitor pushed open the front door and stepped out. Noticing someone heading towards the open door, he stepped to the side and held the door open so they could enter the cafe. Thank you, Pat said as she stepped into Harvey's through the open door. The visitor recognized that voice. That was the voice he heard on the radio all these years. That's who he was here for. He stepped back inside Harvey's and closed the door behind him.